Whatever you want.
I remember when, was it Chaim Weizmann or somebody, the first, before Israel became a state, I'm just trying to think, there's one great Jewish leader at that time came to Toronto. And
Chaim Weizmann.
Okay, I was a kid. Mother took me to Toronto to be in part of that group. It's too bad I can't remember the name. And that was my really, I guess, my first exposure to Yiddishkeit. I also remember that I got married when, Wendy, in 49, I think, didn't I? The State of Israel came into existence in what, 45? 48. In 1947, I was about 27 years old then, I got very friendly with a chap from the Haganah. I can't remember his name now. And we became very friendly. And remember, it was right before the State of Israel.
Right.
And he came to me and he says, Marvin, I need a car and a driver. I said, what the fuck for? He says, we want to take some gun parts across the border. They had a machine shop in Buffalo at that time. This is before the war. So I went to my late Uncle George, and I says, I was approached by Norm Grant was the guy's name. Just mark it down somewhere.
It's on the tape.
Norm Grant, okay? And I took a liking to him. Don't ask me why. He was something like you, being certainly built and all of that. And my uncle said, no, Marvin. He says, give them money. Don't give them the car, and don't give them the driver. So anyway, I go back to Norm. I says, Norm, my uncle said, no, but we'll give you money. He says, Marvin, money we don't need. We need that car and the driver. I says, you son of a bitch. I says, you got it. It was a company car and a company driver.
And the company driver was Andy Noseworthy.
Andy Noseworthy, right? So anyway, I said to Andy, I didn't tell him what it was all about, but the deal was, when I told Norm, he would pick up the car, let's say at 12 o'clock, and take the car somewhere, and then bring it back. And Andy had to deliver a parcel to Chaim Schmerel in Buffalo. So I said to Norm, I says, Norm, how long should it take? He says, maybe, Marvin, 2 hours, 3 hours. In those days, you couldn't do it in an hour. It was about an hour and a half, 2 hours. I said, okay, Norm, but whatever you do, I said, I told the driver to call me once he got over the border. No problem. 3 o'clock, no phone call. 4 o'clock, no phone call. I had a very good friend that worked for The Spectator, Sammy Nyman. And he was a big macher, a poor man, by the way, but he knew his ins and outs, okay? I call up Sammy, I said, Sammy, I think I'm in trouble. And I tell him the story. You son of a bitch, and he starts to give me shit like you never heard before, because we had a good relationship, you know. Anyway, about 5:30, 6 o'clock, I get a phone call. The car was stopped at the border. Because what they did, they put the gun parts under the back seat. And they put a lot of cloth, you know, to keep it from leaking, whatever it was. And then they put a case of beer in the car to make it look, you know, kosher. The custom guy turns around. He happens to see the case of beer and he looks down. Lo and behold, they find it. They take the car and the driver. Now it becomes news in the American thing. Gun smuggling. I hear it and I turned around and Sammy was with me. I said, Sammy, you got to keep this out of the fucking papers. And he says, fuck you, you know. Anyway, make a long story short, they keep it out of the papers, and then there's a big news broadcast of the States. Somebody had to go as high as Truman. Truman was president, if I'm not mistaken.
You're right.
To squash the whole thing, all right? Now they got the car, and they got the driver. They had a good lawyer, I forget the lawyer's name, a Yiddish firm, by the way. the other,
Haganah
the Haganah people,
Yeah.
you see? So they turn around, they get the driver released, there's no problem. It's all hushed up. They kept the car, I'll bet you, for damn near a year. And then we got it back. Of course, it was scrapped by that time because of deterioration. So anyway, that was what happened in '48 with my relationship with the Haganah and all of that.
So the parts never got to where they needed to go.
Oh yeah, I think they were released. I mean, if they got to Truman, they knew what to. They knew it wasn't gun smuggling. They were told, I'm sure, by the proper people that it wasn't gun smuggling for money. It was gun parts for Israel.
Right.
So I mean, that's what I imagine. But we never heard any more from it. After the first snooze blab that was on the 6 o'clock radio, no TV in those days, it was all hushed up.
Really? This was a one-time thing, or this was something that went on?
With me, with the gun parts? Oh no, that was the only time.
But here's the interesting point, Marvin. You said that when you went with your late mother to
Yeah.
Toronto to see who might have been, say, Chaim Weizmann, it was your first exposure to Yiddishkeit.
Well, no, not really, for one reason. My mother was very actively involved in the Hadassah,
Oh,
and also in bringing over a child for $360,
Euphilia.
the Euphilia.
really?
Oh yeah, my parents, my mother particularly, was very involved on a personal level with not only the synagogue, with anything having to do with Israel. My father was very, and my grandfather were very, very generous to any particular causes. So really, I was brought up with that,
Of course.
if you know what I mean.
That's my point. My point was that I had heard it said, and maybe I misheard, that your grandfather didn't carry money on Shabbos.
Oh sure, I'm sure of that.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sure of that.
So when you got to the chicken roost, when he got to the chicken roost,
No, it was my father.
It
My
was your
my
father.
grandfather never went to the chicken roost.
Father you're talking
oh, your father never went?
No,
Or your
my grandfather.
Right,
But my dad, sure, my dad put Maxie Mintz in business.
right.
But I'm just saying, my grandfather never carried money. My dad did.
Okay.
I remember, because my grandfather, Abba Shalom, was very religious, if you know what I mean. And we used to walk to shul. Now, we lived in the North End, and the shul at that time was at Park and Hunter.
Mm-hmm.
And my father, we never let the grandfather go alone. Never. And Saturday mornings, I would have to take the grandfather to walk him to shul
Really?
and stuff like that. So I mean, my background has been very, very oriented with the synagogue, with Israel, etc.
Sure, sure. Talk to me, when you grew up in Hamilton, did you have a lot of Goyish friends, or were most of your friends
Well, put it this way here, I never had too many friends of either kind. No, I'd say most of them were Jewish kids, I'm sure. I remember going to Talmud Torah
Here in Hamilton?
in Hamilton.
Where was it?
Mr. Gorelick, on Vine Street,
Vine, yeah.
with the old Vine Street, where the old
Right. Who else was with you? Do you remember any other names besides?
oh yeah,
Who do you remember?
Milt Schumann. The Pakin kid, what's his name? Sid Pakin, the lawyer who's dead now.
We're talking what, the 30s now?
Well, Sharp was born in 22, so it would be in the early 30s.
Right.
And even the Rosenberg, Howard Rosenberg, I used to go there with. And then one of the other kids was Dan Kaufman. Sam Kaufman, I forget his name now. They were florists that lived here. We all went to the Talmud Torah. We had an old guy, Rabbi Gerelik, and he used to live in the front with the smelling of the herring, and if we didn't do our homework, he used to kick the shit out of us, with the stick and all of that. And yeah, we had a closely knit group, if you know what I mean.
Now, when you grow up in Hamilton, do you remember anti-Semitism as you're growing up here?
Not really, because he put it this way here. How can I say it? Most of the my associates were usually Jewish kids. We never really felt it, with the exception of the odd time, they used to go like this to us. You know what that means, don't you?
No.
Jews killed Christ. You never knew that?
I've never seen it.
Well, now you have. Look at what you've learned.
I've never seen that.
Jews killed Christ.
And they would just hold up 3 fingers.
Yeah. Or they used to call us Sheeny. But in those days, we never thought too much about it because we never really got intimate with them. I do remember, of course, at the time when they had the big, during the war, before the war, when they used to have gang fights in Toronto, when they used to turn around and the Jewish boys got together with the clubs and with the Italians, and they used to have a lot of problems in Toronto. We never had anything like that in Hamilton.
You see, you're only 11 years old when that Christie Pitts riot takes place in Toronto, where they had this really big to-do with, you know, the swastika.
That's it.
And that sort of stuff. But some people, for example, told us about going to Christie, you know, conservation or whatever. Is that what it was called?
Bronte.
Yeah,
Sorry, Bronte.
the Hoffman started that. Max Hoffman and Dave Hoffman's family.
Started what?
The Bronte thing. They were very big contributors.
But some people were telling us that they were sometimes asked to leave Bronte because they were Jewish.
It could be. That could be, because that was on they're Polacks, you know, the Hoffmans.
Yeah.
And the one who can give you more information on that is Dave Hoffman, because he was very actively involved, and the Hoffman family particularly were very actively involved in that Bronte.
What was that Bronte? Was it a bunch of cottages or something? What was it?
No, I don't remember too specifically, Wendy.
Was it like a Jewish resort?
I think it was a Jewish enclave they finally
He's
went.
born here? He's born
Dave
here?
Hoffman?
Dave?
Yeah, Dave I'm sure was, yeah.
Here's an expression that you may have heard or you may not have heard. If you haven't, then you will learn something from me.
Oh, I
Just as
doubt it, yeah.
Learned this
Yep.
from you. The expression that I'm thinking of goes like this, Marvin: things aren't the way they used to be, and they never were. I came to Hamilton in the early 70s, and when I came to Hamilton, people talked about the good old days where the Jewish community was really very much together and so on and so forth. Talk a little bit how the community has changed, you know, as you think about it and as you remember it.
Well, I don't know. I'll tell you why I say that. I say we were very ghettoized. I'm talking about the Jews. We were Orthodox at that time. So we belonged to an Orthodox shul. Then they had the Polak shul with their own shul. And then they had the Reforms. And in a way, and I use the word loosely, we hated each other. Like we said, the best way to kill a Polak is to change the sheets. That was one of the jokes that we used to do. And we very seldom socialized. Like that's why I use the word ghettoized, because we slept within our own enclave, with the exception when young Judea came along.
To where, Hamilton?
Yep.
No kidding.
Yep. I was a member too, a young guy, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And then there was a little bit of intermingling. But basically, we were very ghettoized. We hated the Polacks. The Reforms hated the Polacks, the Polak shul, and the Orthodox shul.
The Orthodox shul was your shul, right?
It was our shul,
It's the
Beth Jacob, on Park and Hunter,
Right.
where the women sat upstairs. I remember when Lil got married the first time. First couple of years we came to shul, Lil used to sit upstairs, and my grandfather was the president. And I remember Shah! And all of those, it was really fun in those days. And then each family had their own apartment in their shul. And we would sit together, like the Goldblatts and the Levies were here, the Pacons were here. And sometimes we'd go after each other. Oh, yeah. But, you know, that was it.
Did you go to shul? Were you one of those that went to shul every Saturday?
Yeah, I had to go to shul, yeah.
That's the way it was.
Yeah.
And you went to shul for the high holidays.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And for Simchas Torah, you went to shul
Yep.
too? That was a big deal, no?
Yep. Yeah, all the old timers would get chicker.
Is that right?
So sure. On Simchas Torah. With the herring. I remember we lived in the North End in those days. We had a guy called Guzner, a nice guy. And he would get loaded, and they used to have to carry him home. I mean, no, really, if you know what I mean. And with the fucking chairs, raising the people up and singing and tying the talesum up, you know.
Oh, sure, they still do that
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah.
They still do that. Do you remember your bar mitzvah at all?
Yep. I never had a bar mitzvah party, but I'll never forget. It was in the summertime. And Rabbi Levine was the rabbi. And they always gave you a sitter. And he would hold up the sitter, and I went to grab it, he took it back. I mean, not intentionally, because he was speaking.
Oh, I see.
And it was hot. We had no air conditioning in those days. And finally I said, Jesus Christ, give me the book. Everybody heard it. I'll never forget that. It was unbelievable. He finally gave it to me. And then we had a cottage at the beach in those days. And then we went back there. And then we never had a party. For some reason or other, parties in those days were not...
You
never had it. I think we may have had a kiddush, you know, in the shul. And then we went back to the cottage, cottage we had rented.
But even the kiddush wasn't a big deal. Like
No.
Basically, you
No.
had some bromfen and you had some herring.
Herring,
or
that's
like
right. Kugel.
That was it.
That was it. Oh yeah, nothing like it is today. Nothing like it is today.
The community was much smaller in those days, right?
Sure.
Did you pretty much know everyone in those days?
Oh yeah. For sure, that's why I say to people today, I'll bet you I don't know 95% of the people. In those days, we knew everybody. You know, small community. And you knew, of course, all of the members in the shul you knew. And indirectly, you always knew a few Polacks. Very few of the Reforms.
Really? You didn't know many of them?
Not many, no.
Why? Because they were so assimilated? They were so...
Well, they were mostly the German Jews, if you know. They were very haughty. They never mixed with anybody else, so we never mixed with them.
That's right. Like, when the Polish Jews came in, they were an embarrassment, I'm sure, to the German people, to the German Jews. You know, like, they were the real greenhorns. And so,
Yeah, the greenhorns, that's what we used to call them, yeah.
Who needed that. But when you grow up here, Marvin, do you know that Jews can't buy property in Westdale? You grow up with that?
Well, sure. I'll give you a better example. When Lil and I got married, before we got married, I bought a house. I mean, we were getting married. It's not that I bought a house on my own. And I live in 45 St. James Place. I don't know if you know where it is, but Wendy can tell you. It's too bad she's not here to hear this story. But anyway, I bought the house. I paid $25,000. And a neighbor of mine across the road was Monty McLean. At that time, I was taking out a Christian girl, name of Helen Percy, who was very friendly with Monty's wife. No, Monty's wife's sister, Kay Nolan. And so that's how I knew the McLeans. And then when I broke up with Helen, I still kept in contact with the Nolans, etc., because in the Army, Patty Nolan was in the Air Force, and I kept in touch with him when I was overseas. So anyway, I buy the house, and all of a sudden, I get a phone call from Monty McLean. Marvin, how are you? Fine. He says, where were you born? I said, what the fuck is it your business? He says, now Marvin, I'm asking you a question. Where were you born? I said, shit, I was born in Hamilton. He says, good. I says, well, what's going on, Monty? He said there is a ruling, I forget what they call it, that no Jews could buy property if you were foreign born. So that was my exposure to that. And then I knew about the Westinghouse situation, about in Westdale, if you know what I mean. But that was my first contact with being affected by it personally.
Even though St. James obviously wasn't anywhere near Westdale.
Yeah.
Right? It still was an issue.
That area, that's right. Except in the north end, it wasn't like that. But that was my exposure to it. And he was very nice. I liked Monty McLean. He was a hell of a nice guy.
When you said a moment ago that You were overseas
Yep,
during the war in the army.
yep.
Were there a lot of Jewish guys that went into the army? That you
Well,
were-
put it this way here. This is another interesting story I can tell you. I was going to the university in London, Ontario, and I was supposed to graduate in 45. I got kicked out in 44. And the reason why I got kicked out, because I really wasn't a student, if you know what I mean. And in those days, if you went to university, you got a deferment. But the minute you got kicked out, in the army, right? So I came to work for the firm. And then all of a sudden I get my call up. I'll never forget, we were on Robert Street as it happens. And my dad called me in with Uncle Rube Oliver Shalom and Uncle George. And I was supposed to report, let's say, Thursday. And my dad says, Marvin, we want to talk to you about it. We had a friend, Mo Rafkin. And Mo Rafkin was a pretty cool guy, you know what I mean? And he came to my dad and says, Frank, we can get Marvin out of the army. And how they used to do it was they had a guy at the Horse Palace, we used to call it in Toronto, where we did our basic training, that you would go there for your examination, and this doctor would turn around and put you in the 4F category. And I think the guy wanted at that time $500. So my dad says, Marvin, this is the situation. And we talked about it. And we decided that we wouldn't do it. I would go into the army. So I got in early or late 44, right? And I'll never forget this. And we lived in John Street in those days. And we did our basic training. And then once we did the basic training in Toronto, which was only for a week or two to getting used to it with the needles and all of that shit, you know, then I find out that the group that I was with, the draft, was going to be shipped out to Calgary for basic training. And I didn't want to go to Calgary. I wanted to go to Camp Borden. And see, they used to do it in shifts. One group in here, and then I had to have an excuse. And I'll never forget, it was a winter night. We had a back porch in John Street. I get on the back porch at night with nothing on over my top. And I get a very bad cold. Anyway, so now we come, I've got to get a deferment. And there was a Jewish guy, Dr. Snyderman, a hell of a nice guy, who was stationed in Toronto. And I had to go before him. How come all of a sudden, you know, you're not feeling well? And I just says, I don't know, I got a cold somewhere. And make a long story short, I was able to miss that draft and then ended up in Borden. And then from Borden, I went overseas. And no, there weren't that many Jewish guys in my group at that time.
Do you remember any?
No, not in the army.
Not in the army. You remember?
I still have my dog tag, you know, with
Is that right?
the thing called J on it for Jew. Yeah, I got to show it to you. I still have it.
J on it for Jew as a
Jewish.
joke, or are you serious?
No, I'm serious. They used to do that. You never knew that.
No.
Oh yeah, I've got the original dog tag. And they call it J Canadian.
Well, what would they do for a Catholic?
They must have done something. I guess C for Catholic, P for Protestant. It's not that they didn't do it as a stigma, by the way.
No, I understand.
But that was it. But I'll show it to you. The J, Canada.
No kidding. Because when we talk about anti-Semitism, Marvin, like for example, you remember when Eaton's was in Hamilton, right?
When who?
Eaton's, the department store.
Yeah, what about
What is
them?
it called, Eaton's?
Yeah, Eaton, yeah.
Yeah. Jews didn't work for Eaton's in those days. When you're growing up in Hamilton, Jews didn't work in the Royal Bank.
No, I'm sure they
When
didn't.
you're,
No, I'm sure not.
because they were Jewish, not because they weren't qualified, not because.
Well, I don't recall any Jewish people in those. See, remember, we were a small community too.
Yeah.
And I don't imagine that, I didn't know anybody that really was a salesperson, I mean, in those stores.
Yeah.
And even with the bank, for sure, very few Jews were taken into the banks, that's for sure. But anyway, but that seemed to be the norm, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Well, where were Jews? I mean,
Beg your pardon?
And you're talking about business and the economy. Where were Jews to be found in those days?
Okay, in the scrap business, in the shmata business. They were usually self-employed, and then, of course, they would turn around and hire Jews too, mostly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They're very ghettoized.
Yeah.
And they all were own their own business. I remember the Kaufmans. They were florists. Very few worked outside of the ghetto.
Can we just mention the scrap families? Who were the big Jewish scrap families in those days?
Frank Levy's father, Uncle Dave Levy. The Waxmans. The Pacons. And a few other old-timers. I just forget their names now.
Well, there's
There are
the
quite a
Rochworth,
few.
right?
Rochworth.
Morris Lax.
Morris Lax. Well, he came later.
Yeah.
Yeah, Morris Lax came later.
And so, was there enough business for everybody? How did it work?
Well, sure, Wendy, they used to start off with a horse and buggy. I mean, that was no jokes. They used to rock around and cry out, rags, bones, and bottles. Behind that office that you see there's a stable. They used to keep the horses there. I mean, not many, 2 or 3 horses. And then in the backyard, I never forget, in Zeta's house, they used to build a sukkah.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah. And then we would eat in the sukkah, not like today, inside. We had one guy I'd never forget, his name was Elmer. And he was a goy that was part of his job was at sukkah's time to build the sukkah with a thatched roof, if you know what I mean. And we'd eat with our fucking coats on.
Of course, cold.
It was cold, sure.
So he was he was an Orthodox Jew, your grandfather.
Sure.
And you remember him well?
Yeah. I'll tell you the respect that my father and my late Uncle Rube had for him. When I was going to college in 1940, I wanted a car. And I went to my dad, I says, Dad, I'd like you to buy me a car. He said, talk to your Uncle Rube. He was a brother-in-law. So I spoke to my Uncle Rube, and he had kids of his own, by the way, remember. And he said, did you talk to Yankee? They used to call him Yankee. His name was Jacob. Yeah, they used to call him. Did you speak to Yankee? He said, yeah. What did Yankee say? He said, yes. He said, if Yankee said yes, you got the car. They had a great deal of respect for him. I'll tell you another interesting story. My grandfather had cancer. And in those days, one of the remedies was if you would get a freshly laid egg, remember what I'm telling you, within 3 or 4 hours and give it to the patient, that was a big cure for cancer. There was a farmer outside of Hamilton. I don't know if it was near Burlington, but it was in that distance. And one of my duties was when the farmer would call up, I would have to get in the car and pick it up and bring it back right away. So I'm doing this 4 or 5 or 6 times. Remember how old I was in those days. And I went to my dad once, I says, you know, Dad, I'm too important to have to go in the car and pick up the fucking egg. Why don't you hire somebody, get one of the goyim to do it? I'll never forget, my dad looked at me, he says, you know, Marvin, you're right. He says, come with me. Get in the car, he drives right to Burlington. After that, I never said a fucking word. But that is strictly in my mind, it's unbelievable. Here I am, a young pisher. I'm too important. And my dad turns around and he says, you're right, Marvin. By the way, I kept on picking up the eggs, so you'll know.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Listen, you're marvelous to talk to.
I know that.
And I enjoyed it.
It's too bad.
I enjoyed it.
Tell me about the values, I guess, that. All right, tell me about the stories. I'm hearing stories, legendary stories about Jacob Goldblatt seeing a homeless family on the street, being evicted, and going to them and helping them. Are these true stories?
Yep.
Can you just mention some of these stories that you heard?
Well, I know, for example, the late Sam Taylor.
Yes.
He came to see me, I'll bet you, about a year or two before he died. And he told me the story about Uncle, the Zeta, that he found out about a Jewish family that needed money. And Zeta never knew him. Anyway, a long story short, he gave him $40 or $50. In those days was a lot of money. And he just gave it to them. I understand you're of Soros. Here's something. You don't have to pay me back. And it happened to be a relation of Sam Taylor's family. That's how Sam Taylor remembered it. And I mean, there are innumerable stories about how generous they were. I mean, all of the Goldblatts, with the exception of Morley, were very generous. I mean, Dede, I know what he used to do. I know what Uncle George used to do. The late Rabbi Silverman told me an interesting story about George. He lived next door to George on Amelia Street, I think it was. And he was very friendly with George. And the rabbi mentioned to me a story once that he's out with George. And George says, Jesus, I had a bad week. And the rabbi says, what happened? He says, nobody came to me for money. So, I mean, the charity has been ingrown with us, if you follow what I mean.
Would people actually line up to Robert Street? Like Bob Rafel mentioned years ago when I did these interviews, that it was almost like a free loan society. Like people would just line up at the doors at Robert Street to see one of the Goldblatts to get a loan. I
got so unpopular that I would throw out some of these guys because we were on the list. They would come into the office and sit there, and none of them ever walked away with nothing.
And who were these people, Daddy? Were they new immigrants, fresh off the boat?
No, they were the Meshilach, what do they call them? The professional beggars. You know, they all had a cause.
I remember some of them coming to Hamilton, even in the early 70s. They
That's
would
right.
up at the Addis.
That's right.
And some of them, I was told, came by taxi.
That's
and
right.
The taxi would take
Wait for them.
from here to here to here.
That's right. Well, it's true. That's true.
Yeah.
But I'm not talking about those guys. I'm talking about the people, like even earlier, who were just coming new to Hamilton. They just come from overseas.
I'm sure of that, Wendy, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what is it?
I'm sorry, Marvin, but
Known, I would have taken the call, but just for a second.
Yeah.
The family were very generous,
Yeah.
exceptionally generous. And like I say, that's why I try to carry on with the tradition of giving tzedakah. And the same thing, I'm hoping my children would follow suit
Sure.
to turn around, if they can afford it, by the way. But I know with the Goldblatt family, they would go over backwards.
Well, that's what people talk about. Seriously.
And particularly the people in St. Catharines. Zeta Oliver Shalom was very, very helpful to the Jewish community in St. Catharines. He brought over the Newmans and all of that. They brought over an awful lot of people. Of course, in those days, that was it. The grandfather came first, then he would send over. I'll never forget the story I heard about Dede. They had to postpone his bar mitzvah 4 times because something happened in the family that they couldn't have it on that date, and they had to postpone it. 4 times they postponed it.
Why would he bring people over who went to St. Catherine's?
They lived there. Everybody couldn't live in Hamilton. St. Catherine's was another shtetl. You follow what I mean?
Did they know?
They went there?
How did they know these people? Were they from the original town?
Oh yeah,
Era?
what they call them is
Shtetl.
yeah. They all were from the same areas, Wendy.
Yeah.
They knew each other, and their relation. My first cousin, my third cousin. That's how it started.
Sure.
That's how the Newmans. Too bad Benny Newman's not around to tell you the story, or Dr. Harry Newman. They'll tell you how good the Goldblatt family were to the Newmans. And there were others beside the Newmans, the Revsons and all of that. Well, they knew each other.